Hey, everybody, welcome back to another anatomy lecture. This time we are moving on to a whole new system, and we're going to start the cardiovascular system, and we're going to be looking at blood and blood vessels today. So let's get started. All right, so starting off really basic, there are three functions of blood. Your blood is used to transport substances around your body. It is used to regulate certain things in your body, like your body temperature, like the acidity of your body. It's also used to, of course, control the amount of gases like carbon dioxide and oxygen that you have in your body. And finally, your blood is used for protection. It's a huge part of your immune system. So, of course, we know all about like white blood cells, but it's also used to protect you from cuts through like platelets forming clots. And it plays a really vital role in a lot of homeostatic functions of the body. One thing to think about when we talk about regulation is if you think about it, when you become hot, what happens? You become flushed. And that flushing is where blood is going to the surface of your body, and you can see it through your skin, making you appear red. And that is used to regulate temperature. So, a lot of really important things happen inside of the blood. All right, so let's talk about how blood is formed. This process is known as hematopoiesis, and we talked about this back in our skeletal system chapter. But this is what's going on inside of your red bone marrow. That's where you find all the stem cells that are going to make the blood. So, speaking of stem cells, your blood is produced by a particular type of stem cell called a pluripotent stem cell. And so, in the world of stem cells, there's a lot of different types. But the main thing to remember is that there are what are called totipotent stem cells. And totipotent means like they have all the power, like total power. And those are the cells that can become any different part of your body. So they can become anything from like brain cells to skin cells to blood cells. Pluripotent cells, on the other hand, are not as powerful as totipotent. So they don't have the power to become anything. But pluri, meaning like more than one, means that these cells have the potential to turn into a couple different types of cells. So the pluripotent stem cells found inside of your red bone marrow can be broken down into two groups, what are called the myeloid stem cells and the lymphoid stem cells. And each of these types of pluripotent stem cells can form a couple different types. So, for example, myeloid stem cells can form your erythrocytes, or what we call red blood cells, thrombocytes, or what we call platelets, and what are called granular leukocytes, which is a particular type of white blood cell, which we'll talk about in a little bit. The lymphoid stem cells form what we call the lymphocytes, which are found inside of your lymphatic system for the most part. So this is where our monocytes or macrophages come from, if you remember that from back in the tissue chapter, the big eaters, but also our T and B lymphocytes or T and B cells, which we'll talk about really extensively when we get to the immune system. But this is like their little like cheat sheet chart of like how these cells all turn into different other cells. So basically, we have this pluripotent stem cell that can turn into any type of blood cell. It turns into either a myeloid or a lymphoid stem cell. A myeloid stem cell can then become all of these different things listed here. So it can become everything from a red blood cell, a platelet, these guys, which are granular leukocytes, or a monocyte. The lymphoid stem cells, on the other hand, can form T cells and B cells. And I just realized that there's a mistake in my notes that I did not put it in correctly. So the monocyte should have been over here with the myeloid stem cells, not with the lymphoid. So your lymphocytes do come from the lymphoid stem cells. Basically, what we find out is that if you look at a red blood cell, very interesting thing. It starts off as this thing called a reticulocyte. It loses its nucleus and becomes a red blood cell. Platelets actually come from this thing called a megakaryocyte, which blows up and forms platelets. And all the white blood cells pretty much just are what they are. Monocytes eventually become macrophages, and B cells eventually become plasma cells. We'll talk about that later. All right, so when we look at your whole blood, when we look at blood in its different components, we find out that a little more than half, about 55% of your blood is made of plasma, which is the liquid part. And plasma, if you look at it, it's mostly water, but it also has some proteins and some other solutes. So you can think about like oxygen, carbon dioxide, different chemicals floating around inside of there. The proteins are broken down to a whole bunch of different groups. One of these is called albumins. Albumins actually help you to maintain the osmotic balance of your blood. So basically, if your blood was pure water and didn't have these albumins, your cells would like keep sucking up water because they'd be inside of a hypotonic solution, and so albumins help to make your blood isotonic to your cells. You have also these things called globulins and fibrinogens and all sorts of fun stuff. But we also find like weird chemicals like electrolytes, which include like all those ions we talked about, like sodium, potassium, and calcium. We find nutrients that your cells need to eat, gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide, and all sorts of nasty waste products and stuff that your cells are trying to get rid of, as well as hormones. So lots of different things are found inside of the plasma. The other part of your blood that is not plasma, so a little less than half, 45%, are what we call the formed elements, which is a fancy way to say cells. And most of those cells, we fit them into three categories: the red, white blood cells, and platelets. So red blood cells, we're going to call them erythrocytes, which quite literally means red blood cell, leukocyte, which quite literally means like white cell, and platelets, thrombocyte, which means clotting cell, which is kind of crazy. But if you look at it, if you were to take a sample of blood and put it in a centrifuge, this is how it would break down. It would end up with a little more than half of it being this clear liquid, which is the plasma, this little thin layer called the buffy coat, which is where white blood cells and platelets go, and this huge red area that is the red blood cells. And so if we look at it, if you look at your whole blood, it's about 8% of your body. And then if we break it down, like once again, we have the plasma with all of its proteins, water, and solutes. If we looked at the form elements that make up the other 45%, red blood cells are by far the most numerous. So we have millions of red blood cells versus like tens or hundreds of thousands of white blood cells and platelets. And then even within that group, the white blood cells actually break up into all their different groups, and you can see how they have different populations, most common being neutrophils, which we'll talk about a little bit later. All right, so let's take a look at these red blood cells. Now, we call these RBCs for short because that's just an easier way to write it, but they're also called, once again, erythrocytes. The red blood cells are very interesting in how they're set up. They mainly are just sacs containing this substance called hemoglobin. And hemoglobin is mostly made of protein, but it also has some iron-containing parts called heme. And so that's where it gets its name from. Heme for the iron part, globin for the protein, because they're globular proteins. And so basically, red blood cells, their job is to just carry oxygen and carbon dioxide around using that hemoglobin. If we look at its structure, red blood cells are what we call biconcave. So they almost look like a donut that hasn't quite lost its center. So it's concave on the top and concave on the bottom. And the reason why they're able to do this is because they've lost their nucleus. So if we go back a couple of slides here, we can see that there was this thing called a reticulocyte that lost its nucleus. So all of your red blood cells are born as these reticulocytes. They circulate for a little bit, pop their nucleus out, and take on this shape. And so by losing their nucleus, they become this biconcave shape where they can now kind of fold themselves to fit into really small surfaces, and they have a huge amount of surface area. So look, all this surface area is all dedicated to allowing carbon dioxide and oxygen to go in and out of the cell without any of those pesky organelles getting in the way. Unfortunately, that means that red blood cells don't live very long because they don't have the guts that other cells do to kind of keep themselves alive. But they're basically, like I said, they're just like little tiny sacs that are going to be used to carry carbon dioxide and oxygen, and we have tons of them. Red blood cells are produced by this process called erythropoiesis, which is quite literally kind of like hemopoiesis. It's the production of erythrocytes. And so once again, we have those little stem cells, those myeloid stem cells that are going to form reticulocytes, and they go around your body for about 2 days or so. And all of a sudden, they just eject their nucleus and become red blood cells. And red blood cells, of course, are really important because they are the oxygen-carrying devices of your body. So if you don't have enough of them, you can have this condition called hypoxia. Literally, it's like hypo, meaning like below, and oxia being oxygen. So you have below normal level of oxygen in the body. And there's this hormone called erythropoietin, or EPO. And Basically, erythropoietin causes you to produce more red blood cells. So if you're kind of like missing something, like let's say you get cut and you lose a lot of blood, your body will produce erythropoietin to stimulate your red bone marrow to produce more cells. So red blood cells have a very interesting life. They only live about 120 days or about 4 months because they don't have organelles. So they don't have a really long lifespan. Basically, when red blood cells get to the end of their 120 days, they get broken down by macrophages. And so I'm going to take you to a diagram to show you this. So here's your red blood cell, newly minted. It flows around your body for about 120 days. And then when it starts to get beat up and damaged, it is actually filtered out in the liver or the spleen in general. The spleen, it's kind of like its function is to filter out these, but you can also do it with your liver as well, especially if you don't have one. So the red blood cells, when they die, they go through phagocytosis. They're actually broken down by those macrophages. And the hemoglobin that they contain is broken down into a couple different parts. The globin part of hemoglobin, because it's just a protein, is broken down into amino acids, and your body actually digests them and reuses them. The heme part of the of the hemoglobin, is broken down into its iron component and this stuff called biliverdin, and we'll get to that in a second. But the iron is connected to this little molecule called transferrin and transferred back to your red bone marrow, where it's going to be used to produce new blood. So let's go back to this for a second. So red blood cells wear out after 120 days, broken down by macrophages, and the hemoglobin is split into heme and globin. Globin becomes amino acids and gets recycled. The iron is bound to transferrin protein, and then it's carried away to the red marrow to form hemoglobin. So far, so good. So far, we've recycled our protein and we've recycled our iron. Erythropoiesis is then used to produce new red blood cells. So if we go back to the marrow, we take that iron that we recycled, we take that globin that we recycled. We need vitamin B12. So if you've ever seen vitamin B12 in your food, vitamin B12 is essential for producing red blood cells. And then that hormone erythropoietin, put all those together, and we're able to make new red blood cells that circulate for 120 days. But there's one thing that's missing. What happens to the biliverdin part of the heme group? So let's go back and look. So the non-iron part of the heme group turns into this thing called biliverdin, which is kind of like a green pigment. So like, VERD, like verde in Spanish, it means green. And this is converted in your liver into this stuff called bilirubin. And so let's go back for a second here. So this biliverdin is converted into this thing called bilirubin and sent off to your liver. Or, if these red blood cells were destroyed in the liver, it could have been there already. Bilirubin hangs out in your liver and it starts to form part of what we call bile. And bile is a substance secreted by the liver into the small intestine to help you break down fats. So we're recycling this bilirubin to help you break down your fat when you eat fatty foods. So once this is secreted, some of this goes through your intestines, and the bilirubin starts to get converted by bacteria in your guts into this stuff called urobilinogen. Wow. If you take a look at that name, the euro in that is from the fact that this has a yellow color and it gets passed on through the blood into your urine. So it actually gets filtered out and it forms this stuff called urobilin, which makes you have yellow urine. So there you go. So because you are destroying old red blood cells, your urine is yellow. Some of this urobilinogen stays inside of your guts and doesn't actually get filtered into the blood and goes on into the colon, where it becomes a brown pigment called stercobilin. And this is what makes your feces brown. So what's really interesting is the next time you go to the bathroom, literally those colors are produced by broken down bits of heme that came from your red blood cells. And because we are constantly making red blood cells, because they wear out every 120 days, you are constantly producing these pigments and you constantly have these same colors if everything's good. By the way, a little health fact for you: if your urine should be kind of like, mostly clear, liquid, slightly yellow tinge to it. And we talked about how like the amount of yellow is your hydration status. Your feces should also be like a pretty normal brown color. But if you ever notice any like weird discoloration in either of these things, it could be indicative of a problem with the liver or any of this process. Okay, so enough about that. That was pretty gross. Let's talk about white blood cells. White blood cells we call WBCs for short. Leukocytes is their like technical name, but it all means the same thing. So there's a whole bunch of different types of white blood cells. The first group are called the granular white blood cells because if you look at them, they're kind of grainy. They have all these little granules inside of them. And so these are the eosinophils, the basophils, and the neutrophils. And so their names actually tell you a lot about them. The neutrophils, they do this thing called phagocytosis, where they go around and they actually attack and kill or neutralize bacteria. So they're kind of out there just like killing things that don't belong inside of your body. So I always remember that the neutrophils, their job is to neutralize any sort of foreign invader or pathogen that shouldn't be inside of you. The second group are called eosinophils. And the reason why they have this weird name is there is a particular type of dye or stain called eosin. And these eosinophils really suck this up. They really like this dye because of what's inside of them. By the way, neutrophils actually get their name because I believe it was a something about like a neutral, like they didn't respond well to acids or bases with these different dyes, but with neutral dyes, they really sucked it up. So that's where they get their name from. But the eosinophils, they produce allergic reactions, and so they cause you to kind of I'm sorry, they reduce the allergic reaction. So they cause you to kind of like slow down and, calm yourself down after you've had a response to something that's been pretty bad. They break down what's called an antigen antibody complex. So they kind of help to break things down after you have had antibodies attack something that's attacking your body. So I always remember that eosinophils, their job is to ease your body. It's kind of like, hey, let's get down off this craziness of our allergic reaction. Hey, let me like break down all this like nasty bacteria that's connected to antigens and antibodies inside your body. And then the last group are called basophils, and basophils are another name for mast cells, which we already talked about way back in the tissues chapter. And so basophils are, they get their name from the fact that they respond to dyes that had a base that were like alkaline. And so these basophils, they produce histamine, to produce allergic reactions. And so I always remember that basophils cause you to break out. So when you have like, acne or, inflammation, something like that, it's from the basophils. So it's real easy to remember. Neutrophils neutralize, eosinophils are ease, and basophils help you to break out when you need to. And here's a picture of what these things all look like. And you can see they all look kind of different under the microscope, but they all look very grainy because they have lots of chemicals. So you can imagine that those basophils are filled with a lot of histamine. You can imagine that eosinophils and neutrophils are going to be containing other chemicals. All right, so that brings us to the agranular leukocytes. And so the first group are what we call the lymphocytes, and these are very closely associated with your lymphatic system. And so there's a couple of these. There's these ones called T cells, and then another group called B cells. T cells are involved with kind of going around your body and doing a lot of different things. Their job is to kind of like identify pathogens and turn on the B cells. So there's a couple different types. There's what are called killer T cells that actually kill things that get inside your body. There's messenger T cells that carry messengers back to B cells. It's very complex, and we'll talk about that more in the lymphatic and immune system. B cells produce antibodies. And so always remember the B and B cells for body. And so they basically hang out and wait till they get messages from other cells, basically telling them what's infecting you. And then they're just like these little like antibody factories. There's a third type called a natural killer cell or NK cell. And these guys, as you can imagine, are really good at killing things. And they're particularly good at killing infected cells, like when your body's under attack. So they just go around, and when they see a cell that's like under distress because it's been attacked, they just go in there and kill it. The other type of agranular white blood cell is called a monocyte. And monocytes are kind of like these pre macrophages. And so basically they kind of hang out, and when they're activated, they turn on and they go around as these what are called wandering macrophages, and they eat up any sort of like broken cellular debris, microbes, anything like that. They're kind of like the cellular cleanup crew of your body. And so they come in and fix everything, usually at like the tail end. So like if you were to like get a cut or a sprain or anything like that, the macrophages kind of show up later and just clean up all the nasty bits that are left over after your body's fought off the infection or healed whatever's broken with you. All right, next group is called the platelets or thrombocytes, and the prefix thrombo means to clot. So quite literally, platelets mean clotting cells. And so the way that they're born is they start off as these cells called megakaryocytes that are born from the myeloid stem cells. Megakaryocytes kind of wander around your body for a very short period of time and then literally just explode into about 2 to 3,000 little tiny fragments of their cell membrane called platelets. So a platelet really isn't even a cell. It's just like a little cell fragment. It's flat. It doesn't have any sort of nucleus at all, has very few organelles, but has a lot of vesicles associated with it. And its job is hemostasis or blood clotting. It's going to help you to block your blood from coming out. So I always think hemostasis is funny because it sounds a lot like homeostasis, but literally instead of keeping your body in balance, it's keeping your blood level in balance. All right, so that brings us to a really interesting topic, blood clots. There's a couple different types of blood clots. There's a thing called an embolus. An embolus is just a generic blockage of a blood vessel. So if any foreign object, or it doesn't even have to be a foreign object, if any object, any hard object blocks a blood vessel, it's an embolus. So you may have heard about like if people get air bubbles or nitrogen bubbles inside of their blood, it can be really bad. That's true. Yeah, you can get an air embolus. You can get little pieces, like when people are in accidents, sometimes little tiny pieces of tissue break off and block a blood vessel. You can get like a fat embolus or a bone embolus, all sorts of nasty stuff. It's really disgusting. A thrombosis is a particular type of embolus known as a blood clot. And this is where inside of an unbroken blood vessel, the platelets start, connecting to each other and they form a plug, and that can block the blood vessel, and that's what a thrombosis is. And so thromboses can lead to a lot of nasty things like strokes, heart attacks. There's a thing called a pulmonary embolism, which is where there's an embolus in the lungs and prevent them from working. You can have a kidney infarction, which can lead to kidney failure, and that's the same thing. It's basically like a stroke or a heart attack where the blood flow is blocked going into the kidney. So all sorts of nasty stuff. All right, so on a lighter topic, let's talk about blood groups. So blood groups, basically, around 100 years ago or so, people were trying to figure out how to do blood transfusions, and sometimes they worked great and saved people's lives, and sometimes they tragically killed people or made them very sick, and they had no idea why. And so around the turn of the century, so the early 1900s, they started finding out that there were these things called antigens or isoantigens that are on the surface of your blood cells. And in fact, they're actually on the surface of all your cells. And these isoantigens kind of are like the ID cards of your cells. They tell you what kind of cell it is and who it belongs to and where it goes and all that kind of good stuff. So we also call those agglutinogens because there's this agglutination where you can literally think of like the cells like gluing together that can happen with blood cells. So there are 24 known different blood groups, 24. The ABO blood group is one, the RH is another, and then there's 22 or more other groups. And then there's 100 different known isoantigens that are possible in all these different groups. So it's a crazy number of different antigens. We don't really care about most of them except for ABO and RH. So the ABO blood group, there's two isoantigens. There's A and B. And so if you look at this diagram up here, you can see there's a cell with an A antigen. Here's a cell with B antigens. And if you have both A and B, you could be type AB. So type A blood, you have A antigens. Type B, you have B antigens. AB, you have both. And if you're type O, you have none. I happen to be type O, so I don't have any antigens at all on my blood cells, at least not for the ABO blood type. And so what happens is that with the ABO blood types, you basically have isoantibodies, or what they call agglutinins, that react with the antigens that you don't have. So for example, if you are type A, let's go to a bigger picture. If you have type A blood, you have the A antigens, but you have an anti-B antibody, so that you could not get type B blood. If someone were to put this type B cell into your body, this antibody would bind to this antigen, and it would cause all these B cells to stick together in a big cluster with the antibodies. And that's what agglutination is. They would stick together and form clumps. And as we said, clumps in your blood are not good, and that could be potentially fatal. So you don't want that to happen. So if you have type A blood, you cannot get type B blood, and vice versa. Type B has these anti-A antigens, so we can't give them type A blood. If you're type AB, you have both different types of these antigens, so you don't have either antibody. So if you're type AB blood, guess what? We could give you type B. Okay. We can give you type A. Sure, that's fine. We can give you type O. All right, whatever. None of those cells will bother you. Now, if you're type O, you're really picky. Your blood cells don't have any antigens, but you have both antibodies. So if we try to give someone type O blood, type A, nope. B, nope. AB, nope. It's all bad. So type O blood can only get blood from other type O people. So they're very selective. So usually when we talk about this, we talk about type O as being like the universal donor, because we can give these blood cells to every other group because there's no antigens, but they are not good at receiving blood. Type AB, we call the universal recipient because they can take blood from everybody. Now, we're just talking about the red cells. Obviously, if we took type O plasma and stuck it into a type A person, that would be a problem because their antibodies would attack these type A antigens. We're just talking about red cells. There's also this thing called the Rh blood group, which is named after the rhesus monkey. So that's where we get this name from. And this was the second group of blood types that was significant that we found. And basically, we found out that some people have this antigen that's the Rh antigen. So they are called Rh positive, and some people don't have it, and they are Rh negative. So basically, positive or negative just tells you whether or not you have this other completely separate factor. And what's weird about Rh is that if you have never had your blood exposed to any other person's blood, you don't have any Rh antibodies. But if you're Rh negative and you get blood that has the Rh factor in it, your body freaks out and starts producing these antibodies against Rh factor. And so then the next time you come in contact with something that's Rh positive, your body goes nuts, just like it would with the ABO blood types. So when we do blood transfusions, here's why this is really important. If you have an incompatible transfusion, it leads to this thing called hemolysis, which quite literally means breaking the blood. So it breaks your blood cells down because of all these antigens and antibodies. Once again, AB can get all the types, O can only take O, and there's lots of other antigens and antibodies which can cause problems too, but these are pretty rare, so that's why we never really talk about them. All right, a couple different disorders that are interesting. You may have heard of anemia. Anemia is where you usually have low blood counts. This can be caused by lack of iron. In fact, that's actually the most common type. A lot of women are anemic because of getting their periods. They lose a lot of blood and their body struggles to make up that blood loss every month. So a lot of times they recommend that women eat more iron. That's why they stick iron into women's vitamins. Another disease is called the sickle cell disease or sickle cell anemia. And you can see a picture of this. Here's a normal red blood cell with its nice biconcave shape. And here is this disfigured sickle cell, which kind of looks like, well, a sickle. And the reason why is we're looking at the amino acids. There is one amino acid that's been changed in this protein that causes the cell to grow incorrectly. And so because of that one switch, we have a big problem. And so people with sickle cell disease, their cells aren't as flexible and able to move around and carry oxygen like they're supposed to, and so that they get kind of like low on oxygen. Hemophilia is the bleeding disease. This is where people are unable to produce platelets, and so therefore when their blood starts to when they break a blood vessel, they just bleed and bleed and bleed. And it takes forever for them to stop bleeding. So that's a pretty serious genetic condition. It is actually a sex-linked genetic condition that's more common in men. And finally, leukemia, that is blood cancer, particularly of the white blood cells. And when people get this, they have to get a bone marrow transfusion because that's where the white blood cells come from. All right, so that is it for our lecture on the blood.